Okay.
Yeah.
First book was Seaweed and Shamans, Inheriting the Gifts of Grief. And that was a memoir about healing after the sudden death of our son, Tommy, in 1994. He was 16 years old when he died, and we were living in California. And uh, that book, actually, I went back to school in my, I guess it was my 50s, and got an MFA in creative writing. And so, as part of my manuscript, I started to write a memoir about my experience after the death of my son. And I remember one of the mentors telling me, she says, "Well, we're not interested in a prescriptive book about how to heal and come after grief, but we just want to know how it was for you." And that was really very helpful for me because at first I felt a lot of pressure because I didn't want to immortalize him and put him as an icon, but it just really was talking about my own experience. And then another writer had told me, well, it's not his story. You're not writing Tommy's story. You're writing your own story and your relationship to him. And these are some of the little things that hold you back as a writer, getting into your own feelings. But that was very good. So the story, it's a collection of essays, and it's mainly about, I called it Seaweed and Shamans, Inheriting the Gifts of Grief, because usually people think that when you're grieving and you're depressed, as I was, that it's all very negative and suffering, which it is. But it's amazing because the human spirit still has this automatic tendency to survive. And it was that way with me. So there were different things that happened, people I saw, places we went, things I heard, or just it's little encounters I had. They were like little pebbles that helped me cross the river from a real deep place of sadness and sorrow to finding light again. So every chapter is about one of those things. It could be my son's friend coming over and stripping down to show me that he tattooed one of my son's pictures on his stomach, and that's a story about a tattoo. Or it could be about my clearing out my parents' house after my father died a year earlier, and getting rid of emotional clutter. So each of those essays is something like that. And I was at that time when I wrote, I think I was in my 50s, but when my son passed away, I was in my 40s. So I say that overall that book, the first book, was mainly text and is my homage to my life and with the tragedy to my native homeland. And then about 8 years after he passed away, when things got a little bit better, my husband, Jan, was accepting an assignment to live in Hanoi, Vietnam for the International Labor Organization. So we went to live there. We lived there for 6.5 years, and while he was working, I got more into not only my writing, but my photography. So my second book was called Vietnam Moment, and that was a combination of photo essays, companioned with traditional Vietnamese poems, proverbs, or song lines. So I collaborated with my Vietnamese sister, my close friend. She started out as my language teacher, but we scrapped that aside because we both got distracted with doing this project. So my question entering that project was, how could a foreigner's impression of Vietnam visually today, could it match and resonate with traditional Vietnamese poems, proverbs, or songlines, which I like? So I would provide the photos, and my friend would look at the photos and see if it resonated and reminded her of some traditional proverb, poem, or songline, which it did. So it was such a fun project because we were waking each other by night or texting each other that she found a picture, we'd debate it. There was one picture showing a young boy and girl at the lake in Wan Kim Lake in Hanoi, and they were like smooching. and we wanted to know what kind of poem would you use for that. And there was one that was a little bit more sexual innuendo, but then we thought, no, we have to be more subtle, so it had something to do about metaphorical fire, flaming. So that was a wonderful project, and I did that because it was an homage to what I would refer to as our adopted homeland. And that was also a way of thanking and reciprocating all the Vietnamese friends and family who had been so generous to us, especially still very wounded emotionally for us. But in Vietnam, where life and death is just like companions. They have a lot of acknowledgement of the death anniversaries, which are more important than the birthdays. So when we first arrived in Vietnam, one of our elder journalist friends, he invited us to a Lunar New Year, and he invited me to bring pictures of my mother and my son and to put it on his altar. So I thought that kind of generosity of spirit was just very moving. And so the history of Vietnam and their mass sorrow really resonated, and we felt very comfortable there and very happy. And that was a very healing time for me. So then by the time I did my third book, Moon Tides, Jeju Island, Grannies of the Sea, Jan was still working in Hanoi. But at that time, I knew that I wanted to come to Jeju Island because I had first come to Jeju in the 80s and had first spotted the Henya. But at that time, I didn't know anything about them. I didn't know I wanted to write about them, but just visually seeing these old ladies in gray hair and rubber suits diving made such a profound influence on me, but it had just kind of been subliminally buried for a while. But lo and behold, on the cover of Seaweed and Shamans, my first book, I chose these photo of seaweed, and it wasn't until after the book was published. One day I'm sitting looking at the book, I look at the cover, there's a picture, there's actually a diver, a free diver going, and it just jumped out of my seat. I had no idea. So I realized that the Henya were starting to bubble up, but they were a dying breed. And I thought, well, if we're living in Vietnam, it makes more sense to go back and forth to Jeju from Vietnam than the United States. Otherwise, the project would never take place. So Jan and I had come to Jeju a few times as tourists, and each time, I think it just got deeper and deeper. At that time, still, I knew nothing. But by the time I started coming to Jeju, it was 2007, 8, and 9. Over the course of 3 years, I spent a total of 7 months doing the research, living in 3 different villages. Basically, when I arrived, I knew no one. So I started out with a homestay, and then I was fortunate to meet through friends, interpreter, translator, Han Young Suk, and then we just started going around. And at first, I was a bit intimidated because I didn't know anyone, and I didn't want to make any major cultural faux pas. But in my research on the Henya, I had only found either one-shot freelance articles by foreigners that did a travel piece, and that was it. And then there were academic papers that had been written by, feminists trying to look at those issues. But there wasn't anything in between. So as a journalist, I was looking for something that was appealing and accessible to the masses, so to speak, but on a level that was accessible and in English. There was nothing. So I thought, this is something I think I need to do. So I started interviewing and taking photos, and that resulted in the book Moon Tides, Jeju Island, Grannies of the Sea. And what I think is different from my book than others that were done even by locals here is that it's someone who's trying to connect to them of Korean American ancestry and of the same age, because by the time I was doing the research, I was already hitting my 60s. So I no longer was looking at them on a pedestal and elevating them to be something that they weren't, but I could relate to them as a peer, as a grandmother. So when I would meet them, I would say to them, I came from the United States, Jenny Chopo입니다, and that, oh, you came all that way. So between my interpreter translator who was able to help me gain trust and entry, I would speak the Hangul that I could, knowing that background and they knowing the background of the first generation that came from Korea, it helped to solidify some initial trust. But these women were amazing, and what I think. And so that became my homage to my ancestral homeland. And what I think is the connector for all the books as I see it, kind of the recurring themes that appeal to me. Even my current book is all about comfort, community, and compassion, and healing. As a writer, of course, and magazines I've worked on where I've done headlines and titles, I understand the importance of metaphors and the importance of having something to draw in. So, in thinking about the metaphor, um, in one of the essays in Seaweed and Shamans, I think I talk about searching for cultural nuggets in my own Korean ancestry that would help me heal. I really couldn't find anything at the time that spoke to a parent losing a child. I came across Native American things and others, but nothing of Koreans. But I knew that Jeju and Korea had a history of animism and shamanism, and I love the sea. And in my collection of essays, I do talk about going to the sea. It wasn't in Jeju, but I think this is the amazing thing about creativity. And when you open yourself up, things just kind of start to bubble up, and you don't know why. But I just knew that Seaweed and Shamans was something metaphorically that would speak to this concept of community, compassion, and comfort. And that's what my book is about, offering that, because people would ask me, God, I'm a parent. If I lost my child, that would be the worst thing on earth. I don't think I could survive. So then I'm thinking, so should I feel bad for surviving? or can I give hope to people to show them, no, you can survive, you will. You'll never forget the pain, but it will slowly, slowly heal. And it'll just become something that's still there with you, but it's stitched up. But it's still there. You don't forget. And then I thought, well, that might be a little too obscure for people. So then I thought, well, let's say inheriting the gifts of grief. So even that was thought out because it's spinning opposite what people expect. That grief is just all a terrible, terrible experience. But in my case, starting from a place of gratitude for all the things that helped me, little by little, day by day, hour by hour, helped me, those things were like gifts. And our support group, grief support group, would refer to these things as gifts. So I said, well, it's like an inheritance rather than only a loss. So the book is definitely about grief, but my spin on it was that you can heal, and the gifts of you can inherit the gifts of grief, and these are what those gifts are. As it happens in so many ways here in Jeju, if you're open, things just kind of start to happen. But you have to be attentive. And a lot of it is just very serendipitous. So one day, I asked my friend to go on the newspaper and check to see if there's anything. And I particularly told her to look for a stone house because I saw development going gangbusters around Jeju Island. A lot of it was Western Mediterranean, concrete, glass, minimalist, but changing the architectural landscape, which was affecting the natural landscape. So I do have friends who are all cultural artists of some sorts. So I thought, well, as foreigners, if we're going to do something here, I want to do something that preserves, that's cultural preservation oriented. So look for Dolce. So one popped up. This was in 2015. So I told her immediately, call the realtor and let's go check it out. So we did. So we came to this spot. There were two very decrepit buildings. One was what Koreans call the ankuri, the big house, and then the smaller one, the pakuri. One was original stone house, and then the other one was more cinder block. And it was about 80 pyong size, and there were mosquitoes about, and there was shrubs. We went inside the house. It was in total disarray, but loved it. I'm trying to think what it is that we loved. What I really loved was the cow stall, where I'm sitting now, and it was originally in the old days in the villages, the people would have a cow stall, and inside they'd have a concrete trough, for the food and the water, which was still here. It even had the chain where they put the rope, and I love this cow stall. It's like a museum, and so we looked at the place, and we really thought what we were investing in and buying, we were going to renovate. But as it turned out, when we hired a contractor that was recommended to us, even without coming to the site, just looking at the pictures we had showed him at the first meeting, he already knew, get rid of the cinder block house. It's not even authentic. stone house and let the field breathe. So on that merit, I thought, this guy, I like him. He's decisive, he knows, and I loved the idea. So we thought, oh yeah, get rid of the cinder block house, but we'll still renovate the big house and the cow stall. Well, as it turned out, even the big building was so decrepit, we couldn't save the beams or anything. And what I loved about the Dolce was the stone. I loved most of these that you see today were in the 70s, and they were considered modern. Instead of a thatch roof, they became these corrugated, now with asbestos, rooftops that are red, blue, and orange. But from the airplane, you look down, that is the architectural colors of Jeju. And then what I always call, they're seamed together, all the different angles, by what I call white frosting, like cake frosting, just white paint. And this is the style, humble style, that I just fell in love with. And then they all have the old beams, and they're rounded, sometimes they're flat, and then they always have the mulberry paper, the rice paper, the hanji paper, the heated floors. So I thought, this is what I want to recreate. But ours would be more of a modern rustic, informed by the elements of the stone house. So with those elements in mind, we were able to use Japanese cedar wood with camellia oil to season it. We used mulberry paper on the wallpaper. We made the ondo. We made the platform outside of my husband's office, the maru. We have kind of bamboo veneer floor. And hwangtabang. This is the red clay, from Korea and Jeju. So even that is good, because even the hwangto has healing energy. And then the crown was going to be my friend Sunja. She was the one that encouraged, you can convert the cow stall into a hwangtabang. I said, what a great idea. Use it for tea, meditation, sitting, writing, meditating. But the roof, we wanted to make it kiwa, which is the clay tiles. So the section in my book that talks about the construction, it's not the ad nauseum detailed minutia story, but it really tells the story of what I learned and to appreciate of the workers who did the working with the different elements like the hanji, the tiles, the ondo, the construction. Even our architect, my husband did a online blueprint. It's very simple, and we gave that to our contractor, so we didn't hire an architect per se, and we pretty much followed the simple floor plan that was before. We made some tweaks, but when he was drawing, to even do the network of the beams, which is very complicated and heavy, his drawings were with chalk or like red pencil on concrete, on the ground out here. So we weren't unfurling some big architectural blueprint per se. So everything was like hands-on. And may I add, all of this was being conducted in Korean language, because he didn't speak a word of English and I spoke some Korean. But I like to say that this house was built with cow talk, which is Korea's version of Skype. We live in this village on the northwest coast of Jeju Island, and it's just minutes away from the sea that we can walk to, and we have a little harbor, two harbors, a little harbor and a big harbor. And so it's a traditional village. In our little section of the village, maybe there's no more than a dozen little houses. Ours is little, propped up on a little hill. But for Ewol, the district, of course, there's several hundred houses. And originally, if it wasn't for the fact that we found this stone house, this dolce, I wouldn't have picked Ewol, because it's become very popular. There's a lot more development here. A lot of tourists love to come to Ewol. One of the K-pop singers has built a cafe that everybody knows about. But it turned out that this was a tiny little pocket that we didn't know about. So we chose to live here because this zone is only for residential. You can't have any cafe or pension, and it's just a little pocket. And there's elementary school behind us, and there's a middle school nearby us, and just out in the front is the little street, which we call our little downtown. So I like the fact that we're part of a community with people. We didn't really want to live in any area that was too remote. And we wanted to be part of a community because part of it for us is to have the experience of what it might have been like for our ancestors or people up to more contemporary times to live in a village. Mm-hmm. We come from the United States. We've lived in suburbs and cities, but that's not why we're here in Jeju. So this is why we chose this area, and we're lucky to find the stone house. Our neighbors are traditional people who either have little cafes, shops, haenyeo. The divers are fishermen, and they're just ordinary working people. Well, at first, we came. Our friends introduced us to the neighbors so they wouldn't be disturbed by all of the construction. So we introduced ourselves, and they were very receptive. They knew that we were Korean Americans. We were no rowdy party people, and then we started building the house. And at first, people would walk by because when the house was vacant, they knew this lot. And they had seen it in disarray, and they were all shaking their heads like, "Oh my God, you bought this?"
Yeah,
but then, it's like, "Oh, these foreigners, they bought that land, that lot." And even our friends who came to look at it, they were like shaking their heads. They said, "This is gonna, are you sure about this?" But no one really discouraged us. They either talked behind our back or they shook their heads after they said goodbye. But in any case, as we started to build it, the neighbors would come around, and they were getting excited when they saw we were converting the castle to a hwangtabang, and we were going to have the ondo, the heated floors. So then they started to get excited, and by the time it was finished, they were very happy to see that our little corner of the world here in Ewell Harbor had beautified somewhat. And then maybe 5-6 months later, about 4 of the other houses owners started renovating their houses, and our neighbor behind us even painted their roof to coordinate and not clash with our clay kiwa tiles. So now our neighborhood has become a little bit more beautified than before, and we kind of started it. But the nice thing here is that, and it was our experience in Vietnam, when a foreigner improves things a bit, they see it as it's improving it for everybody in the neighborhood. So there isn't jealousy, but if anything, it kind of inspires people. So in their own way, some of them built 2-story houses bigger than ours, but they're happier, and we're all giving each other thumbs up because it's our community that we share. I thought after writing Seaweed and Shamans, which was basically about grief and healing, and then Vietnam Moment, which was kind of a meditative book about serenity and peace. And then Moon Tides was about these divers and different aspects of their lives, not just them in rubber suits, but as mothers, as community citizens, as social activists. Then I thought, well, this book is really about a time in our life now that Jen and I are older and not 9 to 5. A more joyful book about finding light and life and starting anew. But then they were saying, it's really about healing. And then it just reminded me, of course it is. It's not the same book as Seaweed and Shamans at that time where I was. But it certainly comes with you, and that it may not be healing from only the loss and bereavement of a child, but also Jen and I are getting older, in our 70s. It's the loss of our physical capacity. It's the loss of friends who are dying. It's the loss of the state of the world as it used to be. So there's so many shapes and forms of loss that, of course, Jeju resonates with me because it suffered and endured, and people are still resilient to find new beginnings, this new generation. Even the development that I am very sometimes horrified by, it just represents life and continuation. So the book that I just wrote is really a continuation of the same themes, but in different contexts for different stage of our life. And of course it's about building a house, but it's really about building a home. And that is the metaphor, again, that harkens back to the idea of comfort, community, and compassion, and being able to immerse in our ancestral homeland, learn more about Korean culture, our roots, and try to engage with friends who are not only transplants from the United States or international visitors or people from the mainland, but locals here. So we have friends on the entire spectrum. Being a journalist, of course, it would be too tempting not to. Well, let me rephrase that. Being a journalist and a writer, how could I not document and write the story about the construction of the house? Um, but that's just one part of the story. So at the point, and so I have a diary, a journal of every day for the whole year and a half that we built this house, going through every emotional angst. And that's not publishable. But by the time that I decided that I'm going to write a book, and I knew from the onset that I was going to end up with a book, I wasn't sure exactly what the whole thing would be because I knew it was all just metaphor. But by the time that I wrote the book, I figured I have to explain why I came to Jeju and what is it that resonates. So that's kind of the backdrop. So then people are going to be interested in the actual construction, but that's technical part. And then the other part is the social part, the community part, living among our neighbors here in Ewol village. So then I thought, okay, my book will have 3 sections. So I tried to think of this metaphor that it's like I arrived knowing, like I parachuted down, and then I was thinking about the divers and all of that. So I thought, okay, so the first thing about Jeju, for anyone who just gets smitten, is seduction. So I'll make the first chapter the seduction of all the things that kind of appeal to me, just, in a very discreet way, not everything, but the key things. Then the second part is like from parachuting, the seduction, landing on earth. That's the construction, building the house. And then the community is immersing more, like diving into the sea, like we did with the Hinya, and immersing and finding out more about lifestyle in the village. So that's how I came up with the construction of the book. So it's basically seduction, construction, immersion, and then it has an epilogue. And the epilogue takes me back full circle to my grandfather who came from Korea before it was divided, went to the United States, and then I feel like I'm kind of coming full circle. And then 2 years ago, after the house was built, I actually became a Korean citizen. So now I have dual citizenship because my grandfather was given a Patriots Award by the South Korean government, and I found out just by serendipity, again by a friend, because I was complaining about having my 3-month visa going in and out, in and out. She says, well, if you're the descendant of a patriot, I think you can apply for citizenship. I said, really? So I inquired, found out. We had a friend help us go through all the hoops, and I went to a ceremony in the Ministry of Justice and Culture in Seoul for ceremony, and there were about 32 of us descendants of patriots from Russia, United States, and China. And for some strange reason, they asked me to read the oath when everyone had to raise their hand. So I was reading the oath in Hanguma, reading it, with TV cameras and practicing and rehearsing it, and became a citizen.
That was a big moment.
That was a very big moment because what started out as more of a pragmatic reason to get a citizenship, all of a sudden I'm seeing all these immigrants to the United States taking their oath and why they become so patriotic, which sometimes to me has always seemed a little too far of a conservative swing. But now, having become a citizen here, I think I understand what it is. It's an emotional, social commitment that you've taken this oath to really care about what really happens to the country that you've become a citizen, and to be grateful for the opportunity. So that really made me appreciate the immigrant experience to the United States, and so now I feel more humbled and committed as a citizen here to do as much as I can to lead a constructive, purposeful, contributive life. Olays is a Jeju dialect term for the small little roads that would lead into the village. Well, now Jeju has way over 20 plus courses throughout the island, the network of trails that take you through the coastline, the villages, all through the different landscapes to enjoy just walking. So people come here now to Jeju. In the past, it was mainly for honeymoons, but since these network of ole trails, so many people come now for the outdoor experience of relaxing and meandering about. Some high achievers come and they get their stamp passports and they try to show that they went from beginning to end on all of these trails. But Jen and I just like to take as much as or as little as we want on different courses, whether they're official or not. So these oles, one day, the one of the courses that we did completely was the one that's here that includes our village area, course 15. So I think that essay is talking about what we saw, and what I love about going through the oles is that we get to see the changing seasons of what crops. One season it's cabbage, another season it's red peppers, another season it could just be the you'll see all the canola flowers, rapeseed flowers. It's just so beautiful to walk through there. You go by the sea, then you go through the villages. You see all the different people. If there are houses on the course, they're making it very pretty and they're opening up little cafes. So you see little businesses popping up. And then you see other people just from different places walking the same course. So it's a very communal experience. And so I talk about that. And then I see this old Halla walking, and she has a little carriage and she's hunched over because of her back. And I realize how fortunate, we still are to be able to be mobile and walk. So I say feet to the ground because part of the joy of living in Jeju is that we are still active and mobile, and that we can either go to Halla and go hiking, we can walk through the croplands, we could do these oles, we can go swimming in the sea. And it's all because we have our lakes there, and we can still be mobile. So that's why I talk about it. It's a blessing to be able to have our feet to the ground. That's a story about, in almost all the villages, they have what they call nettle trees, pongnang trees here. And it's really nice because in the village, these trees are very extraordinary in that the way the wind blows, they all kind of look slanted like the Leaning Tower of Pisa because the leaves all go facing toward Mount Halla. And in the villages, there's always a platform and sometimes some really old vinyl chair or couch. And the old people come around the pongnang tree and they just sit and they rest, especially during the summer in the shade, and they share all these stories. So I talk about the wind and Mount Halla that I often wonder, God, I wonder what they talk about. There must be so many stories that have been shared and gossip under these nettle trees. So I say, where do these stories go? And maybe the wind blew these stories for safekeeping to Mount Halla, which is like the spiritual, mountain of Jeju, and maybe that's where they're being protected. So it's a story about that. One of the books that I loved as I became more of a feminist-minded woman was A Room of One's Own, because Virginia Woolf said that every writer must have not only her own money, her own space, room, and to be able to write. So after I read that book, which was couple decades ago, every house that we had built, whether it was had a garage or not, I would claim a certain amount of space to be a space for me to do writing or art or something like that. So the cow stall became the room of my own.
I was about to
in
say,
this
it's
house.
the Wanja
Yeah,
box,
yeah, yeah.
it's the room
I
of your
could,
own.
yeah. So the largest room in the house, Jan has claimed for his office, and so I said that's fine because I want the cow stall. This is the essay about when you move into neighborhood, or when you buy a house, whether it's in the United States or here, when it's very competitive, you don't have much time to check things out. It's like, do you like this house? Do you like the price? And are you going to buy it? And the window period for this purchase was about an hour. So we had no idea who we were going to be living next to. So as it turned out, our neighbor was an older man who we weren't sure, he wasn't the owner of the house. We're not even sure if he was renting it or if he was squatting, as some locals did during a certain period. But in any case, it's a story about trying to look over the rock fence that we have and try to make some kind of connection. That was pretty funny because coming from uh, living in uh, maybe suburbs, and I'm not a country girl, I'm more city girl. I'm not used to and loving a lot of bugs and all those kinds of things. Well, the charm and idea of living in the country was fantastic for me. But once we actually lived here, and then we're seeing all the mosquitoes and bugs and centipedes, some of which are poisonous and green and 8 inches long that slither into your house, and all these things were things of annoying, not only annoyance to me, things that I just like scream when I see. and one time, my granddaughter was visiting us, and she said, "Grandma," I said, "What?" She says, "There's a big spider on the wall." I said, "How big?" And she says, "Really big." So if Jan happened to be out of town at that time, but of course if he was in town, I'd be screaming, "Jan!" But in this case, it's my granddaughter, so I had to be strong and brave, which was usually not the case in these situations. So I go into the room where it was in the house, and there was a huge spider with his legs altogether would have been 6 inches in diameter. And I thought, oh my God, what are we going to do? So she immediately grabbed her stuff and ran out the room. And so we were trying to plot how we were going to, what we were going to do with the spider. So without telling the punchline what happened, it's this whole story about this harrowing tale of how to get rid of the spider. And also, while the house was being constructed, I wanted to go watch what the workers were doing in the back. And the one that I just see told me, "Oh, be careful, be careful." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because there's a snake back there." And so I had this fear about snakes. And I go, "Oh, snake." I said, "Kill the snake." And he said, "No, no, 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 no." And I realized as I talked to my friends that from shamanism and folklore, the snake is a very important symbol and represents many things. And also, my younger son was born here, the snake. So I know that. So what I did was I get into a meditative mode, and I tell myself I'm going to be at peace with all of these critters, and nothing's going to harm me. And so if I see a snake that's going to slither around, I'm going to realize he's just doing his thing in the garden, enjoying the sunshine, and, let things be. When I first came to Jeju in the 80s, I went to Halim, and at that time they had the Halim hand weavers. And Father Patrick McGlinchey, the Irish priest who came here right after the Korean War, and he's pretty much the one who started a lot of the cooperative farming movement here. He recently passed away. He came here, of course, to promote, Catholicism, but it was after the war. It was ground zero, so how could he do that? So he decided, because he was the son of a veterinarian, to start helping people do the farming. But he had a hard time because at first anything he wanted to suggest, people said, "Anduanida, it can't be done, it can't be done." So finally he started to work with the youth, the 4-H clubs, and started things going. But he was concerned about the women. Well, what can they do? So he thought, maybe knitting and weaving. So he went back to his the church and asked at the in Ireland, "Can you send nuns to teach the women here how to knit and weave?" So he did that. So when I came here first time in the 80s, I went to this Harlem hand weavers, and I remember the looms, like clack, 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 and there's a lot of things that were being done, and they had all these products that were either woven or knitted, and bought one of the Irish iron sweaters that they knitted. And that time I don't think I actually met Sister Rosarii. It could be that she was there and I don't remember. But when I came back after Moontides was written, started building the house, I went back to Halla to find out a little bit more about the history of it. And I also went to the Columban Brothers in Jeju and talked to the fathers there and found out who actually taught the weaving. So they said it was Sister Rosarii McTigue and two other Catholic nuns. I said, well, where are they? And well, she lived here for 30-something years, and then she went back to Ireland. Is she still alive? Yeah, she's alive. And I said, can you tell me where I can find her? So I sent her an email, and at the time she had someone else who was younger helping her receive the emails, and I said, Sister Rosarii, I would love to meet you. I was there many years ago in the 80s. We have the sweater. I would like to come and interview you. So she was very open to meeting me, so I sent her some questions, and she wrote back all of these answers to the questions that I asked her to get down the history, which had never really been published from her point of view. And I said, please be healthy. I'm coming to Ireland. What's more, I'm going to come with my friend who translated this book I did on the divers, and she's a Jeju native, and so you'll meet her too. So I thought that would be the best gift for her, was to meet another Jeju local. So Han Young-suk and I and Jan, we all went together. We wore the sweaters that we had. Jan still had the sweater that his brother had bought in the Peace Corps at the time, in the 60s, and it was still long lasting. And so I had worn the shawl that I had bought at the Harlem Hand Weavers. So that story is an homage in memory of Sister Rosarii. At the time, Father McGlynn, she had not passed away, but in a way now that story is in memory and tribute to both of them, because I'm thinking of them and Fred Destin, who was a founder of the Maze Park in Kim Young, where I also stayed. Fred rescued me from a homestay, gave me a place to stay in Kim Young when I started researching. So these foreigners who have come here, I'm always just very inspired by the ones, because they are the closest peer group to myself, and they've done so much. So I use them as a beacon to remind myself that I too must do something continually contributive to this island and the people as they did. That's a nice essay about two friends of mine, and we get together once a week. At the beginning, it started out just to have a language exchange. They'd speak English and I'd speak Korean. We'd practice and correct each other, and then we added food because it was at my friend's cafe, and then now it's kind of morphed into getting together for art. But that essay is basically talking about how we'd start out eating food, and neither of us speak each other's language fluently, but food became a way to open up stories. And in our broken English and Korean, we started to find out more about each other. And so I found out how they were grieving a loss of father or former husband. And then they had read my first book, because I was translating to Korean about Seaweed and Shamans, Inheriting the Gifts of Grief, and they loved that book. So one day, my friend Stella, she made seaweed soup, and so we all shared that together silently, and I call that a language of compassion. One of the first things that they said that we learned was that many marriages fall apart. So I thought, now why would they say that to us? Coming to the meeting, why would I want to come back? What's the benefit here? So after Jen and I went home, we were talking, and Jen says, "Look, they're saying, look, in the United States, 50% divorces anyway, so maybe it's a higher percentage. So it's nothing off the charts from what is happening in the United States anyway, and we've already been married so many years. So we figured our chances were good, but it's true, and I don't want to be dismissive about the statistics, and the reason is because when you're in a really crisis situation and in a marriage, everything just gets exacerbated. So I think in relationships that have not lasted, maybe there might have been some tension before and everything got exacerbated by the crisis. Or if your relationship is stable and has certain things intact, that can also become exacerbated in your favor. So knowing that, we were very aware that a husband and wife may have parallel but very different experiences with grief. And that was certainly the case with us, as it is with any couple. But we were also very aware and mindful that we would have to have very open communication. We would need to not be judgmental toward each other if we perceived and experienced things differently. So, by then we had already been married, several decades. So for us, we had weathered different obstacles anyway, and this was the largest test, of course. But I think the key was that we had the support group, and then we had family and friends, backing us up. But we took the time to grieve, and I think that's the most important thing. You can't stuff it, you can't avoid it, you can't dismiss it. It's going to come out in some way. And if you're not articulating and going to a support group, you're going to get sick physically, you're going to get depressed and not know how to get out of it. But fortunately, our generation has more resources available than our parents' generation, who have gone through much worse than we did. What I see in Jeju is that they've gone through so much suffering with Sasang, Korean War, occupation, but they do keep themselves busy. But there are so many things in the culture, the rituals, they don't forget, and they remember, and they draw upon the spirits of the ancestors. So none of that is ever forsaken, and that's why I think for us in our situation, from the United States to Vietnam to Jeju, we're fortunate to have been in cultures that are draw from shamanism, Buddhism, Christianity, that have connection to spirit life.